Would you support airlines creating child-free flights? Why or why not? I would prefer flights without people who stand in the aisle while people are boarding. A perfect flight is one where everyone checks in their luggage except for a small carry-on. Overweight people get appropriately sized seats instead of taking half of their neighbor's seat. You have some space between your knees and the seat in front of you. The seats have restricted inclination so no one has to have someone else's head in their lap. The Wi-Fi actually works and is free. The outlets work and can charge your device. The snack and drink is actually a snack and drink, not 1 ounce of warm soda and 3 pretzel sticks. Your fellow flyers took a shower that morning. People are generally quiet and polite. Doesn't seem like much to ask for, but to get all this on a transatlantic flight would cost you upwards of $10,000 per seat. I flew on an ANA flight a while ago that had a great solution to the seat reclining problem. When you reclined your seat, it pushed the actual seat part of your seat forward to shorten your own leg room instead of the face space of the person behind you. Perfect compromise. That's how the seats on ISIS trains in Germany work. Great solution. On some East Coast trains, Amtrak made quiet cars where silence is king. I'd support quiet flights where the only sounds are the engines, occasional pilot announcements, if entering turbulence, etc., and the flight attendant's cartwheels wobbling down the aisle. I ducking love the quiet car. I got more upset on the quiet car for NJ Transit. Silence was golden, but if anyone broke it I would feel even angrier than if I were in a normal noise-filled car. The quiet car had violators every day though, and I kept earplugs and headphones with me in case. First and last cars of NJ Transit cars are quiet cars for anyone who might need that info. I think there are certain hours where they enforce it though. Also, you can drink alcohol on NJ Transit trains as well. I didn't know there was a quiet car on NJT until a woman came and aggressively shushed us. Peak embarrassment for me. I didn't know, I'm so sorry. I think most people who are talking in the quiet car are those who have no clue that it exists. TBH, I don't even know how I came to find out about it. I think I just heard all the shushes and finally saw the little sign they had up about it. The real rules are to talk quietly, not even be totally silent. But those aren't good enough rules for those quiet car vigilantes who need absolute silence. No worries, mate, you're not alone. Edit, a word. I feel like instead of child-free flights, there should be a family section on the plane separated from the other seats. There is on some 757s. I have named it Purgatory. It's in the back end, behind the 2 mid-lavs. Smells terrible, like a porta-potty, and the floor, don't ask me about the floor. Oftentimes that's where families with children end up assigned. Not always, but often enough. That's because the families want all of their seats together and the early bookers with frequent travel have gotten all of the forward aisle and window seats. That, and those back seats tend to be much, much cheaper. When you're buying 4 or more tickets, an extra $25 adds up. At least $100. Really did the math. I've had more problems with adults being loud and obnoxious than children. I'm not really for child-free flights, but I've also never had a bad experience with children on a flight. I haven't had any bad experiences with children either, but I have been bothered by a super noisy bachelorette party led by a bride-to-be who loudly described the sexual encounter she had on their trip with someone who was definitely not her husband-to-be, a stinky guy who periodically shouted free beer during the 2-hour landing delay, a would-be grad student who asked me to proofread his admissions essays, and a countless number of assholes who managed to hog the entire overhead compartment. I wouldn't go out of my way to support or avoid it. I'm going with the cheapest flight at the best time that works for me. I'd rather spend my money on a fabulous dinner and drinks once I get to the destination. Plus, you know the airplane is going to suck anyways, spend the least amount possible and knock yourself out with some anti-anxiety meds. This is probably the real answer. Do we want child-free flights? Yes. Are we willing to pay more than a standard flight for the experience? Not really. I don't know, there's tons of people who bafflingly pay extra to get on the plane first. I'm 100% for child-free flights, but in this case child cannot be simply defined by age. If there's a 2 years old that has behaved and not causing problems, then I'm cool with that. The ducking 40-year-old dude that is yelling and hollering needs to be out of there. I log probably about 100 flights a year for work. Kids aren't really a problem. The worst was a kid crying most of a cross-country red-eye. But that was years and years ago. Most kids will cry for 5 to 10 minutes at a time. And if it really bothers you, a decent set of noise-canceling headphones will run $300 tops. Far less than an airline would charge you for 2 to 3 child-free flights. The overall discomfort of the seating in coach on most airplanes, exacerbated if you're tall, the person in front of you reclines, you're sitting in between people too large for their seats, etc., contributes way more to the awfulness of a flight, in my experience, than kids ever have. I completely agree. I honestly don't mind a screaming child. Like someone said above, it usually only lasts 5 to 10 minutes, and if it's a long flight you often have movies to watch to drown out the noise. What kills me are the cramped legs and sore pelvic bones from basically sitting on a metal frame with cloth on it, or even getting boxed out of both armrests. First class is generally child-free if you're willing to dollar. I flew business, there is no first class for the route I took, and encounter a demanding yelling 6-year-old and an 8-month-old that cried the entire 5 hours. The air hosts offered compensation because of how awful it was. The only time that I've ever flown first class, I was directly behind some tyrannical 8-year-old girl who was so abusive to her father that I felt he needed parental protection services. I specifically recall when they were doing the in-flight instructions about seat belts, and she turned to her dad and said, "Fasten your seat belt, Daddy." He said he would in a minute. She then started screaming at him to fasten his seat belt at the top of her lungs until he acquiesced. This was before the electronics use change, but she was so demonic that, when she turned her iPad on well before the altitude limit, no one said a word. It shut her up, and we all would rather risk the plane crashing than have to fly from JFK to SLC staring at the corpses of anyone who asked her to turn it off. Were you on the same flight as Veruca Salt? Jesus. Maybe I'm just lucky, but I've never found children to be such a big deal on airplanes. It's not like it was going to be quiet anyway, and most times I have headphones so I barely hear them anyway. But sure, if people want it then go ahead, as long as I can go on the child flights for cheaper. I used to fly frequently and now fly only once or twice a year. Children? Occasional problems. Rare even. Adults? Basically an inversion of that. Person of size, elbows, kicks to the seat, grabbing the seat to stand up, smelly, using the tray table as an elbow rest and can't sit still, the list goes on. How about child seat discounts? As a dad who's traveled with babies, I wouldn't be offended by this. If you want to pay a premium to avoid the chance of being annoyed by children, I think everyone wins. Most of these comments are referring to babies and toddlers, so I'll assume that's what you meant too. For shorter flights, I would guess you can influence this based on when you fly. Parents typically either want to try to fly while the child is sleeping, or while the child is awake. They don't want to try to put their kid down for a nap, it just wouldn't work. So parents with babies will often fly red-eye, so their child will theoretically sleep the whole way, and I would guess that parents of toddlers would avoid early afternoon flights. The airline should have better data on that, they might be willing to share it with a customer trying to book a flight. Parents typically either want to try to fly while the child is sleeping, or while the child is awake. This made me laugh until I realized what you meant. I was wondering what other options there were. No, but I would support splitting up economy into children and no children and putting some noise isolation between them. 14 hours Germany to La, 4 babies next to me, screaming so incessantly parents gave up trying 6 hours in. It was so bad Lufthansa gave everyone on board 2 free drinks of alcohol, and I was only 20 at the time. International, I can see value. I see value in dead baby jokes too. Sure. I'd pick the flights with kids on them. Sitting next to a kid gives me way more space to breathe than 95 number 37. Of them behave just fine on a flight. The worst flights I've had have all been because of stinky or oversized adults encroaching on my personal space. Off topic, but I would support child-free movie theaters more. Yes. Oh my god, yes. I have a thing called misophonia, Wikipedia link for the curious, and children yelling and/or crying is one of my main triggers. It's awful and I would love child-free flights.